Jesus or the Father. And right along with that, they tend to teach that Jesus had a beginning somewhere. And so, they're taking away church members from the church when they come in and try to labor with people over this doctrine. And so I think we need to be pretty tough on them, not mean to them, but they don't need to be here because, I had one experience with a student that got in at Wildwood, and it was after I was no longer the president, so I was simply sitting in the meeting. I was working together with them in regard to a week of prayer, and that's when I was still pastor of the Wildwood Church. And this one student, he began very cautiously, but eventually in his talk, he started sounding like one of these people that teach that. So after a while, I waited a little longer, and pretty soon he got very open with what he was teaching. So I got out of my seat, and I went up and stood beside him, and I said, "That's not what we believe or teach here at Wildwood. And, you just better stop right now and not continue your message." And so I did it nicely, but I made it plain that that was not to be. And so he was more honest-hearted than some of them that I've met, but he came later and he talked to me, and we studied together, and I showed him some things, and I gave a sermon later on the topic. And so I don't think he's given it up, but at least he's no longer at Wildwood promoting that there. So, and that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to thrust thee out of the way which the Lord thy God commanded thee to walk in. So shalt thou put the evil away from the midst of thee. Yes.
Sister White says that true rebellion is almost always unturned.
Yes.
So that's why there's such a harsh penalty or response to those that are rebelling against what is clearly presented in God's Word.
That's right. At the beginning, we don't know, whether they're rebellious, but as we work with them, we find out. Now, praise the Lord, Anna Phillips was not rebellious. When she learned that Ellen White did not agree that she was a prophet, she gave up being a prophet. So, she was honest-hearted, but she was deceived. But Ellen White met a lot of others who were rebellious. And even when God revealed to her that they did not have the gift of prophecy, or they were not Christ, they wouldn't give it up. They kept on promoting that. Now here's another interesting text. If thy brother, the son of thy mother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers. Now here is a responsibility for your closest relatives that you have to do something. You cannot just turn your head to what they're doing. But you have a responsibility, or had one in those days. It might be a little different carried out today, but we do have a responsibility. In Luke 14:26, Jesus told the price of discipleship. Luke 14:26, if any man come to me and hate not his father. Now the word hate there means love less. Doesn't mean what we think of when we think of the word hate. In other words, we have to love even father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, in his own life also. He cannot be my disciple. So we have to love Jesus more than any relative, including a husband or wife, and including parents and children. So that's what this principle that we just read in Deuteronomy is asking them to carry through with that concept. And another one, Matthew 10, verses 34 through 36. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father. Now, praise the Lord, not all fathers are at variance with their children, but many are. And the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. So we just have to expect that if we're a true follower of God, we could have to bear that cross of having conflicts with close relatives. But that's the price of discipleship. We have to be willing for that. And yet, keep praying for them and keep hoping that at some point they will turn around. Okay, going back, we look at verse 7. Namely, of the gods of the people which are round about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. So he said, it doesn't matter whether they're a false god that's nearby or one that comes from some foreign land somewhere, but the same is true that you need to resist and not listen to what they're saying. Verse 8, thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him. Neither shall thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him. Now here's the responsibility. You find out that a close relative, maybe your husband or your wife, is deceiving people. And it doesn't say this every time, but it stands to reason that the first thing you do is try to change their mind. You don't just, put somebody up to get killed that hasn't had a chance to give up their false teaching. But if you're unsuccessful and they are still teaching people to serve other gods, then you can't conceal that. You have to tell the leadership what they're doing. No concealing, it says. And our tendency would be to pity them and say, oh, I can't, I love them so much, I can't do anything here. But God says, no, you better make me first. And this individual is damaging my flock, and you need to do something about it. Verse 9, but thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So it's like you would have to cast the first stone. That's one of the main methods they used in the Old Testament, was to stone someone And so the closest relative that learned about it was the one that had to cast the first stone, and the rest would join in and destroy that person, rather than having innocent people or people that are not, strong enough yet in the faith. And this way God preserved, or he would have. I doubt that it was done much. Most of what the Old Testament told them to do, I can't see evidence that they really followed it. But as a result, they got corrupted too, very fast, and continually they were corrupted. And I think we have the same problem as Adventists. We have allowed too many things to exist inside the church, and it has corrupted so much that it's almost to the point where you cannot keep the rule where it ought to be, because too many people would stand in their defense and you wouldn't get anywhere. Verse 10, and thou shalt stone him with stones that he die, because he hath sought to thrust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. It's considered a serious sin to be destroying other people with false teaching, especially that leads to the worship of false gods. And that was their problem. In fact, as a sidelight from the train of thought here, if you want an interesting study sometime, try to gather together all of the warnings about idolatry in the Old Testament. It is incredible how many there are. And you would think that if they would read their Bible, they would not fall into idolatry, because it talks about it so often. And yet that was their number one sin, falling into idolatry. And today, guess what? Our number one sin in the church is idolatry. No matter how often God has warned against it. In Patriarchs and Prophets 4:08 has a very important quote, because many people, when they read things like this in the Old Testament, they sympathize with the sinner and not with God. And they think that God is really unfair to have such a rule like this. There are those who will question God's love and his justice in visiting so severe punishment for words spoken in the heat of passion. Okay, so this is not specifically on this issue, but the principle is the same. But both love and justice require it to be shown that utterances prompted by malice against God are a great sin. The retribution visited upon the first offender would be a warning to others that God's name is to be held in reverence. But had this man's sin been permitted to pass unpunished, others would have been demoralized, and as the result, many lives must eventually have been sacrificed. So we view it that being easy on the serious sinner, sometimes we're hard on the sinner that doesn't really realize what he's doing, or he doesn't really understand yet, but that's not what God asked for. But on the serious sinner that is set in rebellion against God, often we want to be easy on that person. But God looks at it different. Why? Because one person that gets dealt with in strict justice will stop a lot of other people from doing the same thing. But if we're easy on them, many others will spring up. I've thought about speeding on the highway, just to give an illustration. They for people that don't have very much money, the fine for speeding has some deterrent, at least. But a lot of people, they just speed again because they can pay the fine. And so what they're doing is taxing things. They're not trying to stop speeding. They're just taxing it, making some money out of it. But let's suppose that you were caught speeding and you had to pay a $20,000 fine and 5 years in jail. Do you think that would get it stopped? Yeah, boy, people would be watching their speedometer pretty carefully. And so, we as human beings, we don't really go about trying to get things stopped. But God knows that that's a safer path. And so that's why the Old Testament has what seems harsh at times, but in the end would be the most merciful plan that you could come up with. The most merciful. Patriarchs and Prophets 3:25. Love, no less than justice, demanded that for this sin, judgment should be inflicted. God is the guardian as well as the sovereign of his people. Yes?
Stoning seemed pretty bad, but a good hit on the head, it's over.
That's true. Yeah, it's more merciful than we think of. Certainly more merciful than the cross that Jesus died on. He cuts off those who are determined upon rebellion, that they may not lead others to ruin. In sparing the life of Cain, God had demonstrated to the universe what would be the result of permitting sin to go unpunished. It's interesting. Before God gave these strict instructions, he already proved to them that when you let the sinner go free, you have mega trouble down the road. The influence exerted upon his descendants by his life and teaching led to the state of corruption that demanded the destruction of the whole world by a flood. So if God had killed Cain, they wouldn't have had a flood. But God knew if he killed Cain, that people would not understand. So he had to allow the results of leaving Cain alive to follow out its full development, and then it was necessary to kill practically the whole world as a result of it. The history of the antediluvians testifies that long life is not a blessing to the sinner. God's great forbearance did not repress their wickedness. The longer men lived, the more corrupt they became. So approximately every 2,000 years, God has to take a hand in the affairs of earth. First time, he had to destroy the inhabitants with the flood. Second time, he sent Jesus to earth. And as a result of Jesus' visit to the earth, it lifted the human race enough that we could last another 2,000 years. But we are now at the point when he's going to have to wipe it out again. There's no other avenue for him. We'll take one more. 12th manuscript release, page 208, 207 and 8. The wrath of God is soon to fall on all the sinful and disobedient. God's love is represented in our day as being of such a character as would forbid his destroying the sinner. So, Satan works with the balance of something getting in the wrong direction. And while, as we look in the Old Testament, there was, not in the Bible, of course, but in Old Testament times, there was the idea that God was too strict and too severe and unloving and all that. But now it's gone to the opposite extreme, where people are presenting God's love so strongly that it's like, well, if he destroyed anybody, he would be a terrible God. Men reason from their own low standard of right and justice. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such a one as thyself. That's Psalm 50, verse 21. So people start thinking, well, if I destroyed somebody, I'd be awful. Well, it's true, it would be. But to say it's true of God is wrong. They measure God by themselves. They reason as to how they would act under the circumstances and decide God would do as they imagine they would do. God's goodness and long forbearance, his patience and mercy exercised to his subjects will not hinder him from punishing the sinner who refused to be obedient to his requirements. Yes.
I couldn't find the text the other day. Justice long delayed is no less certain. I wasn't able to find that.
Yeah, I don't remember either, but that is true. That's a mistake that people are making, because God's mercy has gone on and on. And, sometimes I've thought to myself, and even said it, that if God doesn't step into this world soon, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah for destroying them, you see. Because mercy has just kept going and going and going, but it cannot go forever. The plea may be made that a loving father would not see his children suffering the punishment of God by fire while he had the power to relieve them. But God would, for the good of his subjects and for their safety, punish the transgressor. You see, those that turn against God and have rejected light, and frequently much light, when they do that, then they become a curse to the people of God. And they're harmful to the people of God. And the people of God are protected by Jesus. And he said, that's enough. You're not going to keep on mistreating them. I'm going to get rid of that mistreatment that is taking place. God does not work on the plan of man. He can do infinite justice that man has no right to do before his fellow man. And here is a very important quote that we're looking at right now, because there's another error that maybe you've been confronted with, and that is that God doesn't kill. Whole books have been written about this. One came to me, I didn't seek for it, but it said, would God kill a tiny little sparrow? And then, of course, certainly wouldn't kill man. And it's kind of self-destruct or something, But this one is the clearest one that shows that their teaching is false. Noah would have displeased God to have drowned one of the scoffers and mockers that harassed him. But God drowned the vast world. Who did it? God. God drowned the vast world. Satan didn't send the flood. The flood didn't just happen. It was an act of God. And he didn't do anything wrong in doing it. Lot would have had no right to inflict punishment on his sons-in-law, but God would do it in strict justice. Yes?
Oftentimes, I think when you read the Old Testament, he always calls his people to separate first.
Mm-hmm.
In Noah's time, he told them to go in the ark.
Mm-hmm.
In
Yes.
but they didn't come. In Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, he told the people, separate from these men, because they're going to be swallowed up. God is so thoughtful towards us
Mm.
that before he does anything, he's going to send out a plea that says, come.
Yes.
Come, don't serve those other gods. Come to me.
That's right.
So he's not really a mean God in the Old Testament. He's a loving God that gives us a chance
Right.
to, as we read and all we see, that he's saying, come to me. And he may do destruction or swallow up people,
Mm-hmm.
and many die, and with the flood, but he's always there saying, come to me.
Yes. In the end, when it's all,
There's a line there.
Er-
There's a line.
yes.
You can serve the other gods, or you can come to me.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were sharing that even when Jerusalem was destroyed, he told all the Christians to get out so that none of them would suffer the things that the rest did. So I think what you're pointing out is really true, that God separates his faithful ones and he protects them, but the others who have resisted light, who have become hopeless, basically, I don't believe God destroys people until they become hopeless. Now, Satan does. He doesn't mind killing people that aren't hopeless yet. But Jesus doesn't kill them until they're hopeless. And in the end, all the people that he destroyed will admit, says every knee will bow. They will all admit that he gave them every chance that they deserved, and they refused it, and so they deserve to die. But we don't have the right to do those things to people. We do have the right to put hardcore false teachers out of the church. I believe we do have that right. But we're not condemning them to, punishment or anything. It's just that we're not to allow them to deceive the other people in the church. Yes.
There's a comment on that line where she said that such a one, if they go to heaven at all, have to go by themselves.
Yes. Yeah, that was in a case of incest that a brother did. And so he could never belong to the church again, but she didn't say whether he could go to heaven or not. If he truly repented, he could go to heaven.